Could the Amazon rainforest be restored? Chapter 1. The River That Remembers. If you fly over the Amazon at dawn, the light doesn't fall on trees so much as it pours itself into a living sea, the canopy curling and cresting, a green tide carrying fog like foam. Flocks rise like thrown fistfuls of pepper. Macaws paint slashes of cobalt and burning red across the morning. Below, tapirs leave stitches of hoofprints in the mud, and in the under canopy, 1,000,000 leaves enlarge the air with breath. This is not scenery so much as machinery, the most complicated living engine on Earth, pumping water and heat through the planet's chest. And this engine, we now know, can stall. It's tempting to begin with disaster. Chainsaws, flames, cattle grazing on a land that was once shade, the prowl of illegal mining dredges lifting mercury into the veins of rivers. But the question before us is not how ruin happens. The question is, could the Amazon rainforest be restored? It is a question braided from three strands: ecology, economics, and ethics. It is also a story, and like all good stories, it begins not with an answer, but with a promise. First, the promise the forest makes to itself. Walk for an hour down a logging road that was abandoned 10 years ago, somewhere on the fringes of a cattle pasture in Pará. At first you meet ghosts, desiccated stumps, thorny vines, grass that cuts like indifferent paper. But then you look closer at the soil and see it stippled with seeds, brown, black, winged, speckled as quail eggs. The wind brings these seeds, birds drop them, bats carry them at night, rivers season the soil with them in floods. The forest is an author of its own return. Left alone, the Amazon writes, natural regeneration is the first law of restoration and maybe the most underappreciated. Where soil remains and fire has not hardened the ground into something like ceramic, where nearby forest can donate the caravans of seeds and spores that wander on the light, the rainforest will come back. It will not be the same forest, not at first. It will be young and awkward, spindly, a teenager with 2 long limbs and a voice that cracks in storms. But in 5 years, it will shadow the earth. In 15, it will begin to stand. In 50, it will hold its own reign. In 100, it will start to remember. This is not sentimental. It is physics stitched into flesh. The rainforest makes flying rivers moisture that evaporates from leaves and drifts inland, precipitating downwind as rain. A mature canopy is a machine for summoning the weather it needs. Let forest grow on a hill, and by the hill learns to drink again. That's restoration at the scale of clouds. But the second law is equally blunt. The forest cannot regenerate where its blood is taken. Topsoil is the rainforest's library, and fire a kind of burning censorship. Too frequent burns glaze the soil, close the pores through which seedlings breathe, erase microbes and mycorrhizae, the fungal filaments that thread nutrients between roots. The hidden internet of a forest, the spores of life can arrive. But with their partners gone, they cannot sign their names on the earth. So, leave the forest alone where we can, help it where we must. On the bank of a tributary of the Xingu River, a woman named Anna softens her fingers with seed oil each night. She runs a small enterprise that began as a circle of neighbors, seed collectors, who trek the forest as if it's a bazaar and each tree a stall. They harvest seeds of jatoba, ipe, acai, and andiroba. They dry them, clean them, store them in sacks tagged with handwritten names. A network buys the seeds for restoration projects across the basin. Anna has a ledger where every seed is a word in a language she is learning to write, and on certain days when the air is high and clean, she says she can hear the forest practicing its future in the sound of seeds sliding into burlap. Chef. Assisted regeneration, helping the composition and structure of a forest return faster and stronger, often looks exactly like this. Teams cutting invasive grasses around seedlings. Field hands planting pioneers that grow fast and throw shade. Cecropia, for example. Then later introducing climax species that take decades but will someday hoist buttress roots like sails. Forests need mosaic thinking. Along streams, plant bands of species that pin the soil in floods. On slopes, trees whose roots stitch steep earth. In the open fields that were pastures yesterday, plant nitrogen fixers that nurse the community. A forest isn't restored with a single recipe, it's healed with a map of microclimates. I once met a man named Joel who had been a ranch hand and was tired of debt and smoke. He had watched pastures throw up white grass that burned every August like a ritual. He had watched calves fail, and the numbers fail with them. Now, on his 10 hectares, he was mapping lanes for cacao under a canopy of inga and cupuaçu, with banana as scaffolding and cassava as patience. He did not call it agroforestry at first. He called it making the land breathe. He was not a saint nor a rebel, just a man who discovered that shade can pay. This is the second pillar, restoration that lives or dies by livelihood. To ask a family to choose the future over the next meal is not environmentalism, it is cruelty under another name. But cacao yields in the shade. Acai does too. Brazil nuts, andiroba oil, copaiba resin, when harvested in seasons and sold in honest markets, tell another story, one where the forest is valuable because it is standing. Agroforestry patches become bridges between fragments. They feed families while stitching together travel corridors for monkeys and birds, the very couriers of seeds who make restoration not a plantation but a process. Of course, there is also the charisma of animals that are more than charming, they are engineers. Peccaries turn soil like tillers, macaws crack nuts and prune trees, tapirs carry fruit in their bellies across rivers and deliver their seeds with fertilizer bows. Reintroduce the dispersers where they have crashed, and you restart the writing of the forest, syllable by syllable. Keep jaguars, and you keep the fear that keeps the herbivores moving, which keeps the seedlings from being mowed down. A restored rainforest is not merely a crowd of trees. It is an orchestra whose music is motion. Some will say, beautiful. But what about the scale? 40% of the Amazon is at risk of drying into something like a savanna if pushed past a tipping point. In certain places, the rain is stuttering. Droughts that once came like comets now recur like seasons. 2005, 2010, 2015, 16, and then the furnace years when, above the forest, the air felt like an oven door that would not close. Rivers shrank, fish died in slow circles, smoke wrote a dark grammar over cities. If collapse is continental, how can restoration be anything but a cup of water flung at a house on fire? Scale looks different on the ground than it does from satellites. It looks like a green municipality signing a pact to stop illegal clearing and then being watched by people with laptops and images captured from space every 5 days. It looks like enforcement with teeth and a court that bites back. It looks like a moratorium on buying soy that comes from freshly cleared land or beef that grazed where forest fell only last year. It looks like supply chains braided to verification and banks that price risk like smoke suffocating. It looks like indigenous territories receiving the legal protection they have earned 1,000 times over and the budgets to defend their boundaries with rangers and drones and patience. When cities and companies make these choices, the signal travels. Farmers don't plant in thin air, They plant in markets. If you cannot sell what you grow on stolen forest, you will think twice about theft. And if you can get paid for rain, the carbon budget, the water cycle, the flood control, the ecosystem services bundled into contracts that honor the living world, then you have a reason to keep trees in the ground. No, payment for ecosystem services is not salvation in a spreadsheet. It is a nudge in a direction that must also be upheld by law. But money is a language we speak fluently. Let it say what we mean. The third pillar, then, is governance that remembers. The Amazon is not one country and not one story. It is Brazil and Peru and Colombia and Ecuador and Bolivia and Venezuela and Guyana and Suriname and French Guiana, a federation of watersheds and wills. Cross-border parks promise continuity. Transnational river councils promise the management of dams and dredges and floodplains. And above all, the oldest nations in the forest, those that do not appear as colors on maps, must be heard. Indigenous lands, we have learned again and again, slow deforestation and fires. They are consultations with memory, sealed in laws or ignored at a cost history will charge with interest. But even this triple-braid ecology, economics, ethics, will fray if we forget the clock. The Amazon has an inbuilt grace period. Even damaged patches can be coaxed back if there is still moisture, if there are still nearby seed sources, if the fire returns not every year but only, say, once in a high decade. But push beyond thresholds, and feedback loops harden. The forest loses rain, trees die back. Less leaf means less moisture. Drought deepens. Fire rips, soils bake, and what once was rare becomes routine. Restoration must therefore run faster than decline, which is to say, it must be planned. Consider mosaics. Think of the forest as a quilt with holes and frayed edges. If you mend randomly, you waste thread. But if you sew the rips that hold the rest together, riparian corridors along streams, ridge to river connectors, edges that are leaking humidity like heat from an uninsulated roof, then you reweave climate within climate. The shape of restored areas matters. A narrow band of forest along a creek can cool a whole valley by shading water and jamming fire's spread. A line of trees between two fragments can let monkeys move seeds and genes. In restoration, geometry is a climate strategy. Then there is the question of what to plant and what to leave to the wind. Purists sometimes write manifestos about only native species, as if the very word native were sacrament. The Amazon is indeed a universe of endemism. But if we're talking about degraded lands with compacted soils and full sun, sometimes a tough pioneer, fast-growing, nitrogen-fixing, unpretentious, will do more for biodiversity by creating conditions than will the delicate aristocrats of the old forest. You plant scaffolds so that the cathedral can hang itself from the sky again. Later, you can thin and enrich. You can reintroduce the symphonic slow-growth trees. In triage, pragmatism is a form of love. And yet, all of this would be ideology if it did not come with numbers. How many seedlings per hectare? How much will it cost? How many hands to plant? How many years to monitor survival and replace what fails? The answer varies with rain and remoteness and the appetite of pasture grass to smother saplings. But there are projects that replanted tens of millions of trees along the arcs of rivers, and projects that did not plant a single one, relying instead on fencing cattle out and letting the seed rain fall. Both can work. The art is site selection. Put most effort where the payoff is highest ecologically, hydrologically, socially. Let us visit a place that chose to become a laboratory for hope. A municipality once synonymous with illegal logging decides to clean up. The mayor makes enemies. Fines are levied. Inspectors are threatened. But satellites do not flinch. And over a few years, the clear-cutting curve bends not to zero, because there is always greed, always poverty, always the month when the price of beef spikes and someone bets against the law, but enough that the clouds start to refill the sky's bowls. In the river's floodplain, fishermen rebuild the rules for pirarucu, the giant fish with a body like a metal blade, so that breeding lakes are given rest and harvests become heavier by becoming slower. Over on the small farms, seeds move in sacks along the backs of motorcycles, and kids learn the names of trees like they learn the lyrics to songs Ipe Amarelo, Kumaru, Castanjera. An outsider asks, "How many hectares have you restored?" The people answer with a different arithmetic. How many dry seasons came and left with less fire? How many women got paid for seeds, and what did they buy? How many birds returned? Numbers, yes, but also narratives, because people invest in futures that they can tell to their children. Restoration fails wherever it is a scolding. It succeeds where it is a story you want to belong to. We cannot, however, talk honestly about restoration without turning to the edges of the basin where the atmosphere has started to wobble. There are forests now that feel like pressed flowers, thin, brittle, beautiful in outline, but ready to crumble. In these places, even assisted regeneration needs a more muscular companion: water management. Small earthen berms to slow runoff, check dams in eroding gullies, re-wetted wetlands to hold the sky's tears long enough for roots to sip them, fire breaks raked and replanted with green firefighting belts, cassava on one side, plantains on the other, moisture held in living hoses. And in years when the drought takes on that vacant look of a predator, controlled burns done early and cool, creating scars that stop infernos later. If it sounds like surgery, that's because it is. We are rebuilding a cardiovascular system. Technology has roles to play that are not heroic so much as patient. Drones to drop seed balls where boots cannot go, AI to sort satellite frames and call rangers when the sawteeth bite, apps that pay seed collectors on time, public dashboards that shame the powerful when they cheat. But if we lean on technology to replace care, we will fail. It is better as the rhythm section than the solo, and care looks like this. A teacher in a river school whose science lesson is a walk under kapok trees. A health clinic that treats mercury poisoning and then boards up the road that leads to the illegal dredge. A prosecutor who files case after case like planting trees of paper. A pastor who preaches that stewardship is not an environmental plot but a spiritual one. A scientist who returns to the same plot every year and counts seedlings until the counting becomes a prayer. Could the Amazon rainforest be restored? Before we answer, we have to ask something riskier. Do we want it to be a rainforest again? Or do we want a museum, tidy zones of green, to quiet our conscience while we continue to clear edges faster than we plant cores? A restored Amazon is not a monument. It is a country of rain. It is messy and loud and resistant to control. It is inhabited by people who have languages older than borders. It is not a place for the fantasy of pristine wilderness, which has so often been a pretext for evicting those who lived carefully inside it. Restoration, to be real, must include justice. Here is the audacity of the project: to reweave climate with canopy, to pay for patience, to govern with memory, and to celebrate the prosaic heroism of fence builders and seed savers and the men and women who carry saplings up slopes in the noon heat, whose calves ache, whose shirts wet through, whose hands again and again fold soil around the ankle of a young tree and press. If you stand there with them and look up, you can almost see it already. The leaves that are not yet there, the macaws whose feathers are still ungrew, the clouds rehearsing their lines, the rivers sweeping the names of towns in their brown cursive. In a good year, you could plant 1 billion trees, and it would still not be enough unless those trees were an overture to protecting the billions already standing. You cannot rebuild a cathedral while burning its nave. So the answer arrives not as a declaration, but as an instruction. Protect fiercely, restore strategically, reward fairly, and remember humbly. Restoration is a verb and a vow. If we keep that vow, if we understand that the Amazon is not out there, but inside the patterns of rain that lift our crops, and the winds that cool our cities, and the migratory paths of birds that cross oceans, and then bring spring to our 8 farms, then the question becomes less outrageous. Could the Amazon rainforest be restored? Yes, in part and in places, in mosaics and with mistakes, with triumphs that are smaller than headlines and larger than lives. Yes, if we are willing to be gardeners for a century, and what is a century to a river that remembers? In the 2nd chapter, we will travel deeper into the blueprints of large-scale restoration, the economics that must be engineered to favor shade over flame, and the strategies to turn tipping points from threats into thresholds we refuse to cross. We will count costs without cynicism, celebrate successes without illusion, and lay out tree by tree, law by law, how the Amazon can learn to breathe more deeply again, and how, in its breathing, the world might find its own. Chapter 2. Blueprints for a Breathing Future. The second act of any story about restoration has to risk being unromantic. It must trade the foggy poetry of dawn flights for clipboards, budgets, and lines on a map. It must ask the everyday question: who does what, when, with which money, and how will we know if it works? The Amazon is mythic because it is immense. It will be repaired, insofar as it can be, by small decisions multiplied into a culture. Begin with first principles, 4 verbs that can carry their own weight: protect, prevent, repair, renew. Protect means holding the intact, the old growth, the deep green vaults that manufacture rain and memory. Prevent means stopping the present tense of damage, illegal clearing, fire escaping from fields, rivers strangled by silt and mercury. Repair is the craft of coaxing life from wounded land. Renew is what we do with ourselves, how communities rebuild the skills, ceremonies, and economies that make protection and repair not projects but habits. If any one verb fails, the sentence breaks. Blueprints, then. Imagine the Amazon basin as 1,000 overlapping maps placed on a table. Every good plan begins by acknowledging that the forest is many things at once: a climatic engine, a mosaic of cultures, an economic frontier, a pharmacy, a pantry, a cathedral, a road network, a river web, a borderland, a home. Map 1. The hydrology of hope. This is a basin-wide map of flying rivers, the corridors of moisture that lift from leaves and fall as rain 1,000 kilometers away. Overlay this with the terrestrial rivers: Negra, Madeira, Tapajos, Xingu, Purus, Jurua, Solimoes, and the spider's silk of tributaries. Now add the floodplains where Varzea forests breathe with the pulse of rising water, the Igapo blackwater galleries, and the peatlands that hide carbon like sleeping giants. Restoration targets leap into focus: riparian strips along every stream, as wide as local law will allow, preferably wider. Wetlands to be re-wetted, headwaters to be armored with forest so that seasonal trickles become perennial threads. Riparian corridors are not cosmetic. Trees shade water, lowering stream temperatures, reducing thermal stress for fish. Their roots knit banks, cutting sediment that would otherwise choke spawning beds. Leaf litter feeds the aquatic food web, turning rivers into conveyor belts of energy. Replanting even 15 to 30 meters on each side of a creek can cool a valley and slow the march of fire, because a green ribbon is also a damp fuse. Map 2. The fire calendar. Fire, once rare in the rainforests before large-scale human disturbance, has become both symptom and accelerant. Assemble a calendar that recognizes 2 Amazons, one that stays wet enough most years to extinguish chance embers, and one that, increasingly, endures long dry seasons when leaf litter becomes tinder. Here, strategy is choreography. Farmers and ranchers must be trained and paid to switch from slash and burn to slash and mulch, shredding residues to feed soil instead of feeding flames. Where burning is unavoidable, it must be early, cool, and bounded, creating buffers that will resist the feral infernos of late season. Fire brigades should be local, paid by preparedness as much as by heroics, trained to patrol known ignition corridors, roadsides, illegal clearings, pasture edges on the hot wind days when a match is a weapon. Drone and satellite alerts can cue teams. Fines must be certain, praise must be public. The goal is to make arson unfashionable. Map 3. Seed rain logistics. Natural regeneration is potent, but it needs couriers. Build seed collection guilds that treat the forest as an orchard with ethics. Certify seed provenance by ecological zone and elevation, categorize by functional trait pioneers, nitrogen fixers, shade-tolerant, deep-rooted, fruiting calendars for fauna support. Each restoration node village, municipality, indigenous territory should host a seed house run by local women and men who know trees by smell and bark. Pay fairly. Keep cold chains where necessary. Stock emergency kits for post-fire reseeding, prioritizing species that close the canopy fast to starve the pasture grasses of light. In this map, motorcycles are pollinators. Backpacks become beehives. Nurseries are the next link. Not government warehouses with tired lines of plastic bags, but agroecological nurseries that are teaching centers, propagate with diversity in mind. Not 20 species for every site, but 200 across the region, matching seedlings to soil and slope. Train youth to graft cacao and cupuaçu, to inoculate seedlings with the right mycorrhizal fungi, to prune for architecture rather than aesthetics, measure survival at 6 months, 2 years, and 5 years. Replace losses without punishing those who tried the forest is a classroom that fails no one who returns. Map 4. The mosaic of livelihoods. Restoration flourishes when it pays its own bills eventually. Agroforestry belts can frame and feed the process. Cacao under dappled shade, black pepper on living trellises, acai in seasonal floodplain gardens, banana and cassava as cash flow bridges. Brazil nut concessions, managed with a union's discipline, can line the boundaries of protected areas like edible fences. Community timber plans can harvest with 100-year horizons. Saw 1 tree, plant 5, publish the plan in a public ledger so that trust can grow. Forest-compatible incomes draw people into partnership with shade. Debt pulls them into sunlit ruin. Credit, therefore, is climate policy. Create loan products whose collateral is a forest plan, not just a fence line. Reward compliance with lower rates. Bind markets to morality. Supermarkets in distant cities must label and prefer produce that grew beneath a canopy, not in a charred clearing. Make consumers complicit in the good sense. Part of the plot. Map 5. Tenure and the law of memory. Where land rights are unclear, chainsaws sound like sentences. Secure tenure, demarcate indigenous territories fully, formalize smallholder claims, recognize extractive reserves, then add an enforcement grid that isn't purely punitive. The forest needs guardians with salaries, radios, and legal backup. It also needs mediators who can solve disputes without repeating the old violence. Courts must be both slow, stately in precedent, and fast, rapid in injunctions when a bulldozer starts its mourning. Build a reputational system that stains, publicize offenses, ban offenders from contracts, treat illegal profit as a debt to be collected with interest. Law, to be respected, must be visible, and to be beloved, it must be fair. Map 6. The corridor lattice. No single patch can be everything to everyone. Animals need to move to feed, mate, and avoid becoming meals themselves. Genetic diversity needs bridges to cross. Select corridors not by straight lines but by animal stories. The leap spans of spider monkeys, the riverine wanderings of giant otters, the hilltop routes preferred by harpy eagles. Where roads sever corridors, build the architecture of ecology. Canopy bridges, culverts widened into tunnels lit by skylights, speed limits enforced by fines that buy saplings. The lattice should prioritize connections between protected areas and community forests, turning isolated sanctuaries into a network of neighborhood parks for species that think in kilometers. Map 7. The data commons. Knowledge is a forest too. Monitoring must be a public service, not a private luxury. Open dashboards that combine satellite deforestation alerts, fire hotspots, rainfall anomalies, river levels, and field reports from community monitors. Let schools adopt local plots and report seedling survival. Let mayors campaign on cooler creeks and longer rains, tracked by citizen science. Pair this with a caution. Do not reduce the living world to graphics alone. Stories must travel with numbers, interviews with seed collectors, profiles of communities that beat back fire, names of lakes where pirarucu returned because someone chose restraint. The data commons should tell a series, not just a statistic. Finance is the spine that holds the maps together. It is easy to curse money. It is better to colonize it. Start with the cheapest capital on earth, protection. Guarding 1 hectare of intact forest costs a fraction of regrowing one. Every ton of carbon not emitted by avoiding deforestation is a discount on an overheated future. Therefore, front-load budgets toward enforcement, tenure, and community stewardship of intact forests. Put the fire out before buying hoses for the next neighborhood. Next, price the labor of patience. Restoration is not a 2-year grant. It is a 30-year saga. Design funds that see like forests. Disbursements tied to milestones over a decade or more, canopy closure, first fruiting, corridor functionality, rather than the shallow metric of seedlings planted. Build annuities that pay communities for living trees, not holes dug. Insist on local banking partners who will open accounts for seed collectives and nursery cooperatives with dignity, not disdain. Pay women promptly. Their enterprises are often the first to be starved by delay. Carbon markets parade in here with brass bands and confetti. Let them play, but do not mistake the music for the party. High-quality credits for avoided deforestation and verified reforestation can channel real money. They can also create perverse incentives, paper forests, and disappointments when promises meet drought. The only credible carbon is carbon bound to community consent, transparent baselines, conservative accounting, independent verification, and grievance mechanisms that bite. Treat carbon finance as a scaffold, not a sanctuary. A better cousin is payment for water. Cities downstream pay communities upstream to keep water clean and predictable, cheaper than building treatment plants or suffering rationing. Hydropower companies whose turbines choke on silt fund riparian restoration because it protects their profits. Fisheries commissions fund floodplain forests because fish are the dividends of shade. Add biodiversity credits that stop short of turning a jaguar into a coupon. Frame them instead as index funds for resilience. If the forest's orchestra regains instruments, peccaries, macaws, tapirs, the music of stability grows. Technology does its part when it behaves as a craftsperson, not a conqueror. Drones can reseed slopes too steep for boots, but their seed balls must be recipes tested by local agronomists who remember droughts and soils better than code. Satellite alerts can ping a ranger's phone, but the ranger needs a motorboat that starts and a babysitter paid for the hours she is in the field. AI can read the forest's pulse from space. Grandmothers can read it from the smell of wind before rain. The smartest systems weave both. Species return is another place where romanticism and rigor must share a tent. Reintroduce dispersers where they are locally extinct. Howler monkeys, tapirs, flocks of curassows, but screen for disease. Train communities in coexistence. Compensate for crop damage with speed, not suspicion. Restore fish populations with patience. Set no-take seasons tied to flood pulses. Empower communities with legal rights to enforce their own management. Monitor with smartphone apps that feel like games, but accumulate data that can sway ministers. In a basin where mercury still ghosts through water, invest in cleanup and, more importantly, in the elimination of the upstream sins. Halt illegal gold dredges. Provide alternative livelihoods with the dignity of skill, not the pity of charity. Genetics matter quietly. Seed zones should be defined by climate envelopes that are already moving. Do not plant tomorrow's trees with yesterday's gene pools alone. Mix local provenances with carefully selected genotypes from slightly drier, slightly hotter edges of the range. Bet hedged, risks spread. Keep records that a curious child could read in 20 years, where each batch came from, which nurseries raised them, who planted them, how they fared. Make the forest's memory legible. Culture is the accelerant of virtue. School curricula should treat the forest not as a chapter in biology, but as the stage on which all other subjects perform. Math problems count seedlings and bank interest for nursery cooperatives. History lessons invite elders to tell of flood seasons before the road arrived. Literature classes read river epics and then write new ones. Music students build drums from legal wood and compose pieces timed to the wing beats of macaws. Their concerts become fundraisers for seed guilds. In churches and temples, stewardship ceases to be an annex and rejoins the main sermon. Gratitude as governance. Media can make shade fashionable. Telenovelas set on agroforestry plots, where romance and ambition play out under cacao fronds, teach agronomy by osmosis. Cooking shows champion acai harvested from floodplain gardens that obey rest periods, not plantations that wrung out wetlands. Influencers stop naming resorts and start naming riparian corridors. A mayor's re-election slogan becomes more trees, more rain, more jobs, and it is true. Justice is not a garnish. Protecting defenders, Indigenous leaders, union organizers, women who expose illegal mines is the moral floor. They are murdered too often. Equip them with legal support, emergency relocation options, bodyguards when they ask, and a culture that treats violence against them as an attack against the state itself. Eliminate the dirty money that launders illegal timber and gold into respectability. Regulate cash transactions at scales where chainsaws hum, require traceability for high-risk commodities, raid offices as readily as camps. Numbers because planners demand them, and good stories should withstand arithmetic. What would a credible decade look like? Year 1. 2. Moratoria strengthened and enforced on illegal clearing. Land tenure fast-tracked for indigenous territories and smallholders. National budgets rebalanced to triple funding for protected area staff and community rangers. A basin-wide seed guild network launched with a goal of 10,000 trained collectors. 2,000 local nurseries upgraded or established. Fire brigades deployed ahead of the dry season across 200 municipalities labeled red. Year 3-5. Riparian reforestation at scale. 1 million hectares of streamside corridors planted or naturally regenerating under protection. Agroforestry mosaics expanded across degraded pasture belts, with credit lines linked to canopy cover. Corridor lattice stitched between 30 major protected area clusters. Community-managed Pirarucu lakes doubled, with spawning surveys trending up. Illegal mercury use in 2 major mining hotspots reduced by 80% through enforcement and alternative livelihoods. Year 6-8. Canopy closure visible in the first wave of restorations. Water utilities and hydropower companies signed into basin compacts that fund upstream forest maintenance. Jaguar corridor functionality verified by camera traps and GPS collars. School curricula across the basin standardized around river and forest literacy. Carbon and water payments stabilized under transparent rules, flowing to communities with less friction than rain. Year 9-10. Fire incidents down by half in former hotspots. Dry season length stabilized in several subbasins, measured by meteorological stations upgraded by citizen science. Seed guilds, self-financing, rates of illegal clearing persistently below political weather. International reputation converted into trade preferences for deforestation-free products, rewarding those who kept the vow. Not utopia, simply a plausible goodness. How much would it cost? Less than rebuilding after climate disasters that are the price of inaction. A basin-wide effort might demand tens of billions of dollars across a decade, money that exists already, currently allocated to subsidies that reward deforestation, to infrastructure that cuts without stitching, to relief that arrives after preventable pain. Rebudget the future. How will we know it works? Because streams run cooler and longer, because smoke readings fall in August, because cameras catch more tapers and fewer trucks with stolen logs, because the price of shade-grown cacao stable enough to write family budgets, because the data commons shows the green creeping back along the veins of rivers like a bruise in reverse, because elders say the wind smells right again. Skeptics live here too, and they are useful. They remind us that governance whiplashes, that markets drift, that droughts revisit like difficult relatives. They note, correctly, that the Amazon's fate is bound to smokestacks and tailpipes far away. If the world outside tightens the greenhouse, the house of leaves will sweat. Restoration within the basin must therefore be matched by decarbonization beyond it. A city that sips acai from a restored floodplain and then drives a fleet of coal-fired cars is practicing a farce. Let trade agreements marry deforestation-free clauses to carbon tariffs. Let the price of imported hypocrisy rise. The edge of despair is never far. But optimism, properly tuned, is not naive. It is statistical. Across this forest, people are already doing the work. A widow who runs a nursery where the seedlings feel like a nursery of grandchildren. A brigade of teenagers who learn to rake fire breaks and who now watch the sky with the disciplined paranoia of pilots. A judge who dented the profits of a criminal timber ring and whose reputation makes other men reconsider their options. An Indigenous council that uses drones and spirits in the same breath, neither trivialized. A rancher who traded 20 hectares of heat for a corridor of shade and who now says, quietly, that the mornings feel like they used to when he was a boy. Multiply them. The blueprint is really a mirror. When politics grows toxic, people look away. Restoration is an invitation to look toward, not at a paradise lost, but at a neighborhood under renovation, scaffolds up, dust in the air, plans taped to walls, neighbors arguing over paint, meals shared on overturned buckets. It is imperfect and loud and prone to setbacks. It is also how cathedrals are rebuilt, not by a single genius, but by trades learned and taught, by hands that come to the site daily, by the endurance of ordinary decency. So, could the Amazon rainforest be restored? At the end of this chapter, the question sharpens. It was never a true or false test. It is a fill in the blanks whose answers we write together. Protect million hectares of intact forest with budgets that match their importance. Prevent fire across municipalities with trained brigades and early season burns limited to days a year. Repair kilometers of riparian corridors by year, prioritizing headwaters and stream orders 1-3 first. Renew livelihoods for families through agroforestry credit lines, with repayment schedules pegged to the patience of trees. You can put numbers in those blanks tonight and be wrong by morning politics. Stutters, rains arrive early. A mine is stopped or slips forward, but the grammar holds. Protect, prevent, repair, renew. The sentence reads. And because sentences make paragraphs and paragraphs make chapters and chapters make books, one day the book might describe a forest that remembers more than how it was hurt. The forest does not ask for perfection. It asks for fewer alibis and more apprenticeships. It asks us to accept that hope is a tool, not a mood, that planning is a love language, that wealth is not only stored in banks, but in damp air rising from a million leaves, that the people who live where the forest breathes are not obstacles to be moved around on policy slides, but authors whose names belong on the cover. Let us end where we began, in the green tide at dawn. The canopy is not silent. Each leaf makes a letter on the page of air. Seeds whisper into burlap. Boots crush soft paths. An egret lifts, trailing its reflection from a creek that last year ran dry and this year holds a ribbon of sky. Somewhere a child counts saplings with a teacher and announces, after a moment of frowning arithmetic, "We need 10 more here." She is right in a way that shames budgets and emboldens them. 10 more here. 100 more up the slope. 1,000 along the river. 10,000 planted and tended, but also 1,000,000 not cut. The Amazon does not need us to be heroes. It needs us to be neighbors with long horizons. If we accept that role, if we make laws that last longer than election cycles, markets that reward restraint, and rituals that thank rain, then the restoration will not be a campaign, but a character, part of who we are. Could the Amazon rainforest be restored? Yes, where water still listens, where seeds still travel, where justice is not a guest but a resident, where the verbs align, not all at once, not everywhere, not without loss, but enough to bend the fate line away from fever, enough to bring back the weather's kindness, enough to earn, leaf by leaf, a future that is not a rumor, but a climate we can stand in, breathe, and call home.